We are really privileged this morning, in the midst of a rainy fall day here in New England, to welcome two Scottish, nay, formerly English visitors to campus here, Joan and Oliver O'Donovan. They are both at present honorary fellows at the University of St. Andrews and the University of Edinburgh. Oliver O'Donovan, formerly the professor of Christian ethics at the University of Edinburgh, and prior to that, for 25 years, the Regius Professor of Moral and Pastoral Theology at Oxford University. They are both theological ethicists of the first order. It's a remarkable testimony across a whole generation that they both bear in their works together and their independent works. We are limited this day to hearing from just one of them. The faculty had the delight of talking with both Joan and Oliver earlier this morning, but to the podium we're just going to invite Oliver. The work that they both have been engaged in, Oliver especially so, has been to think about the contours of biblical theology as it impacts theological ethics. What are the restraints and the opportunities that emerge if we take the Scriptures as the ground for thinking ethically in a time like ours? Deeply influenced by the Augustinian tradition, they have both written on the history of ethics and in particular about the present crisis in political ethics. They are theoreticians of great significance across the academy. They have been consultants to the Archbishop of York, significant members of the ecclesial community, as well as the community of the Guild. We know Oliver's work early on, The Desire of the Nations, Resurrection and Moral Order, later work, The Ways of Judgment, that tried to understand from three different angles the unique challenges to speak into the political space that we face as committed believers. They are a wonderful couple, each significant ethicist in their own right and members of a robust ecclesial community as well. They speak, if I might say so, in Augustine's two cities, the city on earth and the city of heaven. They have a voice in both places for sure, and we are grateful for that. Today, I think our topic is pride's progress, the nature of vice in the New Testament. And I suspect you're in for a real treat. We will hear a small lecture and then a time of Q&A. And so keep your ears open, and then we'll let you open your mouths. Oliver, come join us.
My thanks to Dean Lintz for that very generous introduction from both Joan and myself. The theme I want to share with you today is a fairly strictly New Testament one, to try to persuade people who study, profess, research, and do other things in Christian ethics just from time to time to open the New Testament has been one of my ambitions in life. Like most ambitions, very inadequately accomplished, but today I thought I would just discuss with you one of the ways in which in the New Testament we find ethical questions raised and dealt with and see what we can learn from it. The topic of sin is often treated in the New Testament by means of a distinct literary form, which is a list of vices. And of this form, there are, on a reasonable count, depends exactly what you include and leave out, but a reasonable count, 6 examples in the New Testament. The function of these lists has sometimes been said to be mnemonic and catechetical, which strikes me as very unlikely. You just try to memorize all 6 of them, and you will know what I mean. There could be perhaps no more difficult task for the memory presented by the New Testament than these lists. They present a variety of ways of mapping the field of sin. Each is different from the others. They do, however, have a considerable rhetorical force, and we can well imagine that a capacity to deliver a string of deprecatory nouns and adjectives could have been a very admired accomplishment in some early Christian preachers. I don't advise you to imitate it, but it does have its power. They convey very strongly the conviction that one sin leads to another. They're shaped to convey the idea of progress, piling up their vocabulary in impressionistic ways to build up tension and arranging their contents in idiosyncratic sequences. Simply for illustration, I want to glance at 3 of these and then spend a little longer over a 4th. The sole example from the Gospels is the list of evil deliberations in Mark 7:21. And that's a pretty simple example. It goes like this. Out of the heart of man come sexual sins, thefts, murders, adulteries, expropriations, malpractices, trickery, sensuality, envy, malicious talk, pride, folly. 12 items. All of them nouns, 6 of them in the plural, followed by 6 of them in the singular. And the orderly character of that is explained by the parable that the list is introduced to illustrate, contrasting the innocuousness of what goes in through the mouth from the uncleanness of what comes out from the mouth. Actions give expression to what lies within. So the 6 plural nouns refer to performances in the world, the 6 singular nouns to dispositions in the heart. And by going from one to the other, the list carries our attention back from the things we do to the things we are. In Galatians 5:19-21, the only instance in which one of these vice lists is paralleled by a comparable list of virtues, we find a list of 15 works of the flesh, and they unfold as follows: sexual sin, uncleanness, sensuality, idolatry, magic, hatreds, strife, rivalry, rows, quarrels, party divisions, gangs, killings, drinking bouts, orgies, and such like. And here the distinction between singular and plural is not orderly in the way it is in the Markan example, but there is a clear sense of direction in that list. It starts with an erotic focus, sexual sin, uncleanness, sensuality, and moves to violence, passing en route through corrupt religious practice, idolatry, magic. So the failed relation to the self, the erotic failure, affects a failed approach to God, the religious failure, and yields a failed relation to other people and society in general, the failure of violence. Then take Romans 1:28 following, which outlines the debased mind resulting from idolatry, with an outsized list of 21 sinful qualities, the construction of which is interestingly complex. There are 5 sections in this list, of which the first is introduced by the adjective pepleremenus, filled with, and has 4 abstract nouns of a very general type. Filled with every unrighteousness, malice, acquisitiveness, wickedness. The second, led by the synonym mestus, stuffed with, contains 5 more abstract nouns representing social dysfunctions: resentment, murder, strife, deceit, deviousness. Then the third section quickens the pace, shifting from nouns to adjectives and naming 6 evils of speech, which begin soft and end loud: whispering, defaming, God-cursing, contemptuous, overbearing, boastful. And after these sections of 4, 5, and 6 items respectively, the 4th section has just 2 items, but with 2 words apiece. They have additional emphasis: deep in evil schemes, irresponsible to elders. And then the list rounds off with a galloping coda of 4 adjectives with the initial alpha privative in Greek, which we express in English with the suffix less: mindless, faithless, heartless, ruthless. So the list has begun with personal dispositions. It's gone through antisocial behavior, corrupt patterns of speech, and forms in which social cohesion is undermined, and has turned full circle to end up back again with personal dispositions. In general, we can see in these lists an exploration of the capacity of sin to progress within the dynamics of a historical society vulnerable to conflict and of historical agents liable to corruption. And so they can offer ways of connecting sin to a single principle. The single principle can be accommodated within this sequence of vices as a beginning or an end, a source from which the stream flows out, or an ocean into which the stream debouches. Now, this leads us to another point about New Testament ethics in general. In the New Testament, we find a place for sin in eschatological expectation, in underthinking about the end. If world history is to have a climactic disclosure, so will sin. In an age when all that is hidden will be made plain, sin too will be made plain. We are to expect an abomination of desolation, the appearance of a man of lawlessness, and the meaning of this appearance is plain. It bears the recognizable stamp of the first sin in its last complex appearance as outright warfare against God's will to bless the human race. What is to be disclosed in the last days is present, concealed in the world, and so it is in eschatological sin that the unity of all sin is discovered. And this point is made very clear in the 4th of the lists I want to discuss with you, which is 2 Timothy 3:1 following, which introduces a catalogue of 18 moral evils with the words, "Understand this, that in the last days there will come times of difficulty." I say 18, you can count them as 19 if you like. There are in fact 18 vices and 1 negated virtue, and they're all expressed in this list as masculine plural adjectives. The 2 first and the 2 last begin with the prefix phil in Greek, loving. Men will be self-lovers, money lovers. That's at the beginning. They will be, at the end, pleasure lovers rather than God lovers. So here you have the chiastic X structure. Self at the beginning, God at the end, money in the second place, pleasure in the penultimate place. But those pairs are not synonymous. As there's an evident progression from self-love at the beginning to refusal of God at the end, so there's a progress from love of money at the beginning to love of pleasure at the end. And the intervening 15 items describe this progress. 4 form an inner framework, 2 pairs of personality features in 3rd, 4th, 16th, and 17th places, with 11 terms in between, describing a variety of relational failures. 3rd and 4th place, we have 2 synonyms for pride: boastful, overweening. And in 16th and 17th places, these are balanced by 2 suggesting loss of rational control: precipitate and intoxicated. So here then is pride's progress, as arrogant and overweening attitudes at the beginning of the list acquire a dynamic and dangerous energy through the 11 failures of relational engagement in the middle, which begin with abusive speech and disobedience to parents, some educational failures, one might suppose, then followed by 4 negative epithets with initial alpha: ungrateful, irreverent, unaffectionate, implacable. After 1 positive term referring against to evil speech, the next 3 are negative, but forward-looking, perhaps, rather than backward-looking, uncontrolled, unfeeling, ungenerous. And the list, in the middle list, concludes with treacherous, which prepares for the character term precipitate that follows it. Now, I'm just interested in the beginning and the end of this list. The beginning is not the beginning of all things. This is not the first sin that Adam committed. The end is not the last sin of all. This is not the man of sin emerging on world history at the end. It does not start in satanic pride or end in confrontation with the Antichrist. Yet, in sketching an unfolding of sin from an immanent to a more explicit form, this list places sin within the general framework of what is going to emerge in the last days. We become aware through the changing face of sin not merely that there are many different ways of going wrong, but that there is a pressing pace of history which leads to ever more concrete expressions of rebellion and obedience. Its beginnings and endings are not absolute beginnings and endings, but neither are they just chance beginnings and endings, possible points of entry and exit along the paths of sin. They are themselves pregnant with possibilities and so reminiscent of the absolute beginning of sin in pride, and they are forms of sin that are of themselves embedded and immune from challenge, and so they forewarn us of the absolute end of sin in the prideful warfare of evil on good. There's a very interesting last note at the end of this list, expounding the last phrase, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, which is accounted for as holding an outward form of godliness while denying its power. And this explanation is very significant. For the pleasure referred to at the end of this list is not a purely sensual or immanent pleasure, but a destructive presence of pleasure which takes form as a kind of religion. It is indeed the ultimate polemical target of this whole section of text. It's where the apostle wanted to get to. The eschatological disclosure of evil clothes itself in an order, structure, and organization which looks extremely religious. It incorporates a pseudo-transcendence into its wholly self-oriented approach to the world. Well, so far my aim has been basically to shake in your minds that prejudice about these lists in general and this one in particular, which seems to be very common in the commentaries, namely that the items in these lists of vices are put together with no particular order in mind. That's a quotation from a much-used commentary on 1 Timothy, referring to this list in 1 Timothy 3. It seems to me they've been put together with a very definite order in mind, and always with the intention of explicating and exploring something about sin. For the remainder of my time, I want to take a slightly broader view of this longest of the vice lists in the New Testament, and begin from the clue afforded us by that opposition that frames it: love of self to love of God, love of money to love of pleasure. Now, in those terms, one cannot fail to hear a certain echo, and that is of the writings of Philo of Alexandria, first-century Jewish philosopher theologian. This is not to assume anything about the knowledge of Philo's texts in the early church, merely to suggest that since Hellenistic Jewish writers of the period moved in similar thought worlds and deployed similar concepts, we can learn from the differences without speculating on their genetic relationships. The list is strung out between the poles of self-love and the love of God, two terms which come with considerable frequency in the works of Philo. But prima facie, it's rather different from Philo in two respects. First, where the Philonian rhetoric always comes back in the end to a simple and radical opposition between vice and virtue, here we have what is to all appearances, as I've suggested, a progressive depiction of how things develop. Secondly, it differs in the unexpectedly forward position it gives to the love of money and its distinction from the love of pleasure. What is it that is most important for Christians in this claim about the love of money? The love of money is the root of all evils, we read in 1 Timothy 6:10, a famous assertion, a Greek proverb, which was at least 5 centuries old when it was quoted by the apostle, and it continues to echo around all the early Christian writers. On the face of it, this pagan account of the origins of sin locates the source of corruption in exposure to the world and its riches. And there's therefore rather in tension with a Jewish tradition, which we would find in Ben Sirach and in Philo, which locates the source of sin in pride and self-involvement. Now, once pose that alternative, however, the vice list of 2 Timothy 3 looks like a conscious undertaking to bring these two competing perspectives on sin together, situating the love of money firmly within Philo's emphasis on self-immanent pride. Love of money comes second in the list, flanked by self-love before it and arrogance after it. It's thus being interpreted as a spiritual failure, and its relation to the more worldly and social manifestations of sin is seen to that of being of a root to its fruits. And so for the apostle in 2 Timothy, as for his contemporary Philo, the most immediate expression of the progress of pride is self-love. That is to say, self-immanence, a withdrawal into a preoccupation with one's own life, holding apart the precious self from the harsh light that the encounter with others might throw upon it, declining to find peace in the community that others offer. Pride takes initial form as an individuality that would be separate from community. Its only peace is to do its own thing uninterrupted. that other people should, by their simple presence, offer a broader and better peace than pride can offer itself, lies beyond its comprehension. It's a state typified in classical drama by Shakespeare's Coriolanus, who, while intensely interested in honor, cannot bear to hear his achievements publicly praised in Rome, ostensibly for the modest reason that what he's done is just what any loyal Roman ought to do. But that modesty hardly conceals a belief that no achievement could be of any use to Rome which was not simply a replica of his own achievement. Having pictured himself as the paradigm Roman, all other real Romans are an embarrassment to Coriolanus, and that he should have to go around canvassing their good opinions in order to be elected to the honor he believes is his due is simply humiliating. Coriolanus is a social being. He needs human approval, as we all do, but he's not prepared to pay the price of sociality for it, which involves mutual communication. And that is what pride amounts to. There is a formal representation of public honor without mutuality. One might say the burghers or middle-class version of Coriolanus's military self-consequence, and that is wealth. It forms one of the three symbolic objectifications of pride with which the New Testament repeatedly concerns itself. In warning us against the love of money, it has in view precisely the power of wealth to offer us a dignified but wholly false projection of ourselves. Not all dealings with money are love of money, not even all wrong dealings with money. Sins in relation to money can be of many kinds, as can sins in relation to other objects. Timidity, folly, anxiety, these can all have money as their focus, just as they can have learning, building, decision-making as their focus, and so on. But there's an always beckoning possibility for pride in relation to money, which is no less attractive to those who don't have money as it is to those who do have it, trading upon its isolating, elevating power, the fact that it makes us someone. And it's for this reason that we can come to love money for itself rather than as an instrument for achieving other things. In Jesus' parable of the rich fool who hoarded up goods and was not rich towards God, there's a very striking effect where at the climax of the story, the rich man turns to himself and addresses himself. I shall say unto my soul, soul, like that. We feel an elemental narcissism at work here. Here's somebody who's really interested in looking this way. Reality will prove that it actually doesn't lie within his power to pamper and protect this soul to which he is addressing these loving promises on the basis of his wealth. St. James, in a paradox that hardly gets the notice it deserves, invites the poor to boast in their exaltation and the rich in their humiliation. That is to say, the thing we should all appreciate about money, he tells us, whether we have it or whether we don't, is that it comes and goes. As a politician who clings to power at any price has actually lost the one power that mattered, which was the power to carry through some concrete policy he had in view, so the rich who accumulate wealth have actually lost the only power of interest in wealth, which is the power to spend it effectively. They shrivel up, St. James adds, in pursuit of their affairs. The moral question the New Testament poses to wealth, then, is precisely the question of its use. Money is the purest of instruments. It is the indeterminate representation of a power to act determinately. It confers power to do something, but it doesn't specify what that something is to be. And so the apostle tells those who are rich to be rich in good works, putting their resources at the service of practical reason. Love of money begins when the notice we pay to money exceeds the instrumental purposes we have in mind for it, and terminates in acquiring and retaining it. Unbespoken financial resources offer a fantasizing self-reflection, a mirror in which we can see offered back to ourselves all kinds of unreal selves. We come, as the first letter to Timothy has it, to hope in the indeterminacy of wealth. In clinging to the indeterminate, we become indeterminate in our purposes ourselves. We hope merely to be sufficient for anything. We overreach the objects of action in the world and venture on empty imaginations. So much for love of money at the beginning. Turning away from reality to imagination is a destabilizing move, and the proud soon finds, who withdraws, the proud of withdrawal has no ground on which to stand. So at the end of this pride's progress, the proud has taken the world substantially into himself, not in the form where it's positively available as materials for work or communication of social gifts, but in a self-referring form which constructs engagement with the world around personal experience as pleasure. We might have anticipated that pride's progress would end in oppressiveness, with the proud imposing terms for coexistence upon other people. And that feature is certainly present in this vice list, in the socially disruptive attitudes at the center. But the list doesn't end with that. It ends where it began, with a focus on the proud subject. And that subject has not remained unchanged. His original self-abstraction, expressed in the love of money, has been converted into a form of dependence on the world as the condition for satisfactory experiences, for comfort. An unexpected turn, perhaps? We tend to think of the love of pleasure and the love of comfort as a soft sin rather than a hard one, a sin of underdeveloped character in contrast to a rigid surface in pride. But disdain has to make terms with the world in the end, and it ends up by being taken hostage by it. The proud are brought low in this respect too, that they cannot do without a world to afford them a satisfactory experience of themselves. And so there emerges from this list of vices that curious figure that the apostles had in view from the beginning, the religious entrepreneur with his following, but no intimates, we may be sure, just a following, for whom the command of ritual and dogma affords the social form he needs to mediate the world to himself as a pleasant experience. A figure that those of us who are in any sense professionally connected with religion ought to meditate on for some time and to try to warn ourselves by. Let me pay briefly a little attention to the sense of the term pleasure. There's an interesting and difficult passage in St. James which speaks of pleasures as the source of wars and fighting. Whence come wars and fighting among you, he asks, is it not from the pleasures that camp in your members? And English translators of the Bible go to great lengths to conceal James's plain meaning, hedone, pleasures, in various paraphrases. We find bodily desires, appetites, passions. That's a sample from well-reputed modern versions, with lusts, covetousness, prevailing in the Reformation versions. And the reason for this wayward tradition, which goes right back to the Vulgate and its Latin concupiscentiae, is clear enough. The translators did not understand James's two assertions. that the origins of war are found in pleasures, and that pleasures conduct military campaigns within the bodily members. And in their puzzlement, they fell gratefully upon the verb desire in the next verse, as though it were a kind of self-correction on the author's part. But pleasure in the philosophy of the ancient world always carries echoes of Epicurus. And Epicurus was emphatic in his denial that pleasure could involve any agitation, excitement, or sense of lack. Pleasures are enjoyments, satisfactions, not wants and dissatisfactions. They are states of mind we rest in comfortably. Not necessarily sensual, but in whatever, focused on whatever blessings of creation we find most comfort in at the time. Their danger, as the apostle sees it, is that they encamp, they take over, they take control of our instinctual reactions. To relate to created and providential goods rightly, we are told by the tradition we must learn to pass through them, or in the classical formulation, use them in the service of the kingdom of God. If they become the controlling fixed points of our universe of values, shaping our unreflective sense of what we may expect, they create, as James goes on, desires that can yield no purposeful prayer, but can only be frustrated, since they aim at preserving a zone of comfort which must, for better or worse, be washed away in the end. And that is what James, in a close echo of our 2 Timothy text, calls friendship with the world, otherwise enmity to God. The world here, not the world of reality, not the actual world we encounter, but the world of the imagination, the world we have built for ourselves, the world with which we feel comfortable. And as love of money mirrors back to us a self clothed in honor, so love of pleasure mirrors back to us a self invested with power over the world, capable of shaping it to our liking. So love of pleasure is the form in which the list of vices touches on the seductiveness of power. Love of pleasure begins where power is conceived in the service of self-maintenance and self-protection. All engagement with the world involves some exercise of power over nature and over one another, and to refuse all power would be to refuse existence. But it is given to us to exercise power for others through the communication of gifts, not only for ourselves by making ourselves comfortable. As God's purposes for history approach their fruition in the city of God, so the possibility of the perversion of communication by self-referring power also approaches its consummation. In speaking of an eschatological disclosure of sin, the New Testament has in view the formation of a collective identity opposed to and in conflict with the true ground of community. The sin of the last days asserts a ground of comfort, security, individual or collective, over against the possibilities of communication in common tasks and blessings, and against the arbitrament of love, which is the readiness to find rest in others' presence without imposing our terms upon them. In pride, then, human agency refuses mutuality. To borrow a resonant phrase from Hegel, it refuses the I which is we and the we which is I. The second discovery of the self in community and the renewal of community through the self. Pride's progress moves from withdrawing the I from the we in apartness and solitude to trying to master and take over the we by the I. A refusal to treat the instruments of communication as instruments that they are becomes an insistence on treating the subjects of communication, other people, as mere instruments. But talk of I and we doesn't take us quite far enough. It takes us only as far as immoral man and moral society, the understanding of pride as a failure to integrate socially. The eschatological character of pride appears when the we is overtaken by a false we, a collective tyrant, such as we find at the center of John the Seer's visions of the Antichrist. For every I carries its imagined we with it, constructed in accord with its own self-image, and it's this that can be imposed upon the hazards of encounter with other people to ward off the real we that might emerge from that encounter. So the question is not whether we can speak of the word we and speak of community and speak of togetherness, for we certainly can, but whether we can speak it truthfully and effectively. The we that fulfills and completes the search for a second self cannot be imposed or constructed. It can only be discovered and received gratefully as a given reality brought to new clarity. All this supposedly in the last days, though the dynamic described here is hardly unknown to any age of history. Yet the New Testament wants to suggest to us, under the shadow of the end, its appearance hastens. There is a dynamic here which assumes a concreteness of form which will appall us by its appearing. Pride marches with progress of every kind. It would not surprise the apostolic author to learn, I think, that the technologically most advanced societies in the modern world have come to be, at one and the same time, the most controlled societies and the societies most systematically devoted to furthering pleasurable satisfactions. I shall leave it at that. Hope there's something for you to come back to me on there. Thank you.
We'll keep the microphones moving around here, but Professor Donovan, I might just ask the first question. Sin has come alive in these lists, if I hear you correctly, and it is a strange thing that we communicate the language of sin as if it were really quite dead, but there is a progress. Why do we often miss the growth, the way in which, like a cancer grows, sin grows? This, I take it, is the underlying narrative to the list you're trying to suggest. Why don't we often see that? Or what's the obstacle, the hindrances? Why is it that the commentator says these are just put there without any reason?
Yeah. I think it's because when we think in ethical categories about virtues or vices or right and wrong actions, we switch off what the New Testament has to teach us about history and about salvation in history. Ethics is, in common discourse, often a very timeless discourse, one in which, and it's a very punctiliar discourse, one in which there are moments of decision. Well, there are, of course. That's not wrong. But moments, one in which there is a right here and a wrong opposite to it, but not one which somehow is part of this world reaching its crisis that is presented to us in the New Testament. And it's a task, I think, for theoretical Christian ethics, is to learn to think its ethical categories evangelically in this way. in the context of the revelation of Christ and the coming of the kingdom of God. The only way we have that very commonly this is done is in what one might call the old Whig doctrine of progress. Things are getting better. That's obviously not what the New Testament wants to tell us, but what does what the New Testament want to tell us? How can we more subtly and more competently think of the ordering and growth of possibilities and temptations in the light of New Testament eschatology? I throw that out as I don't have a slick answer, but I think that's the source of the problem.
Thank you, Professor O'Donovan. I was wondering whether you would be willing to actually say that pride is the quintessential sin or the root of all sins? And if so, what would you respond to say, feminist critics that would say it's actually, that is a male understanding of sin or the essence of sin, and one should consider sloth as being sort of the equivalent? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I do think sloth is a significant sin, and I do think feminist concerns that have, as it were, drawn our attention to other forms of sin than the classic ones have been helpful. The discourse of virtue and vice, of sin and well-doing, ought to be a conceptually extremely rich one. One of our problems in modern ethics is that we have now for a couple of centuries worked on the assumption that it's the goal of ethics to become conceptually as economical and impoverished as it possibly can. There is only one good thing in the world, and that is the goodwill. So Kant tells us in the 1780s. And although we have different candidates for what the only one good thing of the world is, it's quite difficult in the modern world to challenge the notion that there's only one of them, whatever it is. An ethical discourse ought not to be monotone, I think, and there ought to be an exploration of all kinds of possibilities. The kind of place that I'm claiming for pride in this list is, of course, as a kind of heuristic gathering point from which one can see tendencies and dynamics that exist in other sins too. And one can see their relation to what one might call the bigger story of the encounter with God and mankind, and the coming of judgment and redemption. Pride is peculiarly important as it focuses the creator-creature relationship in a very striking way. And so it forms neither the big all-inclusive sin, nor the only really important one, or the first one, but a sort of thread that runs through the multitude of sins that shows up where they go and what they mean in a certain sort of way, like a nice yellow thread running through a multicolored tweed that you can follow. It gives a color and a direction to the other threads of other colors too. And that, I think, is the sort of claim that I would make on the basis of this list. It's clearly not intended to reduce everything to pride.
I take it this is not a new issue for us today. That is to say, selfishness seems to be a plague on our cultural house, especially acute in our day. But I take it that this is part of the narrative of humanity. And so how do we carefully indict our own selfishness without supposing there are other golden eras in history where pride did not manifest itself. Ours is an age, as many social historians refer to it, as the age of the self. Is that a fair estimation for preachers?
I think there is a peculiarly modern problem about pride. While obviously agreeing, I've not been discussing a modern text, I've been discussing 1 Timothy. But 1 Timothy thinks that there's something rather modern about pride. That is to say, it says it's showing you something about the last days. There is a certain form here that is going to be significant. And with development of any kind, this form may expect to emerge. So in that sense, we can see our age as in a peculiar way in it. One of the things I think that we do need to take note of when trying to understand our own age and modernity is that we have conceptually structured the discussion of a lot of things in a way that makes pride and self-love indispensable. The gentleman who was born a couple of hundred years ago, only about 15 miles from where Joan and I live, Adam Smith of Kirkcaldy in Scotland, did, of course, bring this forward in its clearest way as a hypothesis. The great thing is that we can look after our self-interest while providence looks after the common interest. And by looking after our self-interest, we can be sure that the common interest is being looked after. Now, that thesis of the, as it were, the intentional separability of the self and the other. I have certain responsibilities, and they begin and end here. I don't say anything bad about anybody else. I just know what my concern is. That, it seems to me, is, as it were, pride as withdrawal, theoretically embodied in a structure of a way we think politically and economically, and unhelpfully, one has to say, because it's not actually possible intentionally to do that, and it would be wrong if it were possible. One notices very much in observing justifications for international involvement in strife, in conflict, that whenever the United States or Britain has to get involved in somebody else's quarrel, or other people have to get involved in other people's quarrel, the account you have to give of it in public is that you're defending your own interests. Now, usually one's own interests are always going to be a factor. Usually the motivation for such steps are extremely complex, and the balancing out of one's own interests and wider interests is a complex matter. But there's a kind of public behavior that's required, which is to assert one's own interest in a situation as a ground of right. That is to say, the other person's need, the other society's need, could not be in public discourse a ground of right. That's what seems to be implied. So even if I do have a partially altruistic reason for getting involved in some other nation's civil war or war, I'm not allowed to make it plain, because that would be breaking the rules of international discourse. So we have set up a number of forms of interaction which absolutely seem to depend on self-interest as the kind of logical, meaning-given element. And that is very peculiar of the modern world, I think. Sorry, I've been going on too long about that one. It's too interesting.
Thank you so much for a very provocative presentation. Oops. There we are. Okay.
I'm wondering, in light of your presentation, how you would critique at least some versions of virtue ethics, a la a Stanley Hauerwas. As I listened to your presentation, one thing that struck me is that you're dealing with vices, and many of the virtue ethicists are dealing only with virtues. And second, in this listing, you're seeing a listing moving from action to character as well as character to action. And for most virtue ethicists, it's only going one direction. I'm wondering if you think I'm right in that, and I'd just be interested in your overall response to a virtue ethicist such as Hauerwas.
Those are two very nice comments. I accept a measure of truth in both of them. And the contemporary fashion for virtue ethics was aiming to recover something, which was quite important. And that was to get away from the punctiliar concentration on the right decision and the wrong decision as the exclusive focus of ethics, and to be able to talk also in some way on the meaning of ethical decision and ethical life for what one is, for being a human being of a certain kind. And with that general concern for broadening the discourse of ethics, which went with this fashion, I can only say I would want to associate with myself. At the same time, I do notice a number of things that I don't find in the virtue ethicist, and one is an interesting concentration on plurality of virtues. Not only that they don't talk about vices, they don't, on the whole. Apparently there are only virtues, not vices, but they don't mark clearly in my mind the distinction between talking about virtues and virtue. The plural, which to me is really fascinating. Why should there be many virtues? Why should there be not only courage, but also wisdom? Plato was worried by that. He thought, you know, there's something wrong here. It must be that courage really is wisdom under another name or another aspect or something like that. But the same goes with vices. Why are there many ways of going wrong and not only one way of going wrong? And I think to give a rich account of the virtues, one has to go beyond talking about virtue, that one has to talk also about the forms of action that constitute this virtue as valuable, as really appreciable, as a form in which the dignity and beauty of the human agent can shine through, and so on, and why that very different form also acts as a mode and a channel for so doing. So here you see a rather conscious attempt to preserve plurality in a discussion of the vices, for what it's worth.
Hi, my name is Walter. I have a question here. I'm not really sure if it makes sense, but here it goes. As you contextualize sin, its development, as far as we can glean from the four referenced New Testament lists that you mentioned, do you think you could also use the actions of Rehoboam following his succession to the throne as a context, as you did using Shakespeare's character?
I'm asked to take another example, am I?
And I'll bring up a little scripture here just to refresh your memory.
Yeah.
This is 2 Chronicles 8. But he abandoned, this is Rehoboam, but he abandoned the counsel that the old men gave him and took counsel with the young men who had grown up with him and stood before him. And he said to them, "What do you advise that we answer this people who have said to me, 'Lighten the yoke that your father put on us,'" that is King Solomon. And the young men who had grown up with him said to him, "Thus shall you speak to the people who said to you, 'Your father made your yoke heavy, but you lighten it for us.' Thus shall you say to them, 'My little finger is thicker than my father's thighs.' And now," Whereas my father laid on you a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. That's the passage that came to
Yes,
mind
yep,
as you
yep.
were speaking.
And I'm being invited to ask whether this will do as well as Coriolanus. Yep. That's it. Yep. Well, I'm glad you brought that fascinating story up. If one starts asking, why does a young ruler do anything so utterly stupid? The story is a complicated one, isn't it? And our first reaction today might be, well, he's plainly insecure. And I think that's not a bad first reaction or first account to what this dangerously rash young man Rehoboam was about. Behind it, however, one has to detect a certain kind of disdain. That there is, I think you wanted to draw attention to the fact that he can't learn from accumulated wisdom. There are people around who could give him some quite useful information about how you get on in ruling, and he's not prepared to listen to them. He rather is prepared to listen to people for whom asserting themselves as actors, making an impression, making their mark is the ultimate overwhelming priority. These young advisors who want to see the new reign take on a distinctive stamp. So we have a certain insecurity, we have a certain sort of isolation from a context, loss of context, which I think you were pointing me to in your question. Is that right?
So actually it came up to me when you brought up James 4, that passage and passage that I really like, and also I never knew that word for pleasure is actually not so much maybe it's not the right word to use there. And I'm relating it to how, the reason why it came to mind is because he uses this kind of like 2 and 2 strategy, which you, in your argument, talking about the development all the way, from, what we know of the beginning to what we know of an end. Remind me what it was, of sin. So you're talking about pleasure leading to, not pleasure, but
The love of money and
love of money, right? Love of money leading to love of pleasure.
love of pleasure, yeah.
Right. So, and then I just kind of, I'm thinking of kind of the whole progression from David to Rehoboam, or from Jesse to Rehoboam. That's probably better. And I see like this, what you're talking about in a very big way happening. And I've never kind of seen that.
Well, I'm glad you drew our attention to it. It seems to me Rehoboam is a very important moment in the biblical narrative, and the way his personal being wrapped up with his own power and his own dignity impacts on the life of Israel so disastrously is
Community.
exactly is very important to the narrative.
Last question. Nick.
So when we look at Paul talking about the last days, and it seems sometimes there's this sense of like progressively things are getting worse and worse. But when you look at other places in the New Testament, you see things like the kingdom of God is like a seed that is going to grow and grow. Do we see, is that a tension? Is there a relationship? How do we see both of those thoughts in our world playing out right now between pride's progress and I guess the progress of the kingdom of God? Is there room to be optimistic and pessimistic, or how do we think about that today?
The words, "these are the last times," are not simply descriptive. That is to say, they are not written by an angelic historian of the human race who can say, yes, 21st century, the last chapter. And well, I think we have first of all got to understand how these words function in New Testament discourse. These belong to moral reason. And what they're telling us is that as we live and seek to live in obedience to Christ within this world, there is a horizon opening up in front of us. And that horizon contains promise above all, first and last, the promise of the coming of the kingdom. It also contains, in a very equal way, difficulty. Difficulty is a feature of the future, one might say, an aspect of the path before us, and we always have to be able to see the kinds of temptation that militate against obedience and claiming the promise, always maximizing themselves before us as a danger. We are never in a position with the kingdom of God already present, already totally there, in which we can just sit down and sing a hymn. We can look forward to that. We can anticipate it. We can count on it. But we live in a world in which there are snares in our way. And these also have their logic. Their seriousness, their openness has everything to do with the proclamation of Christ. Balthazar actually goes to the point of saying, I think in perhaps slightly overstating it, but I think picking up this New Testament theme, that the real meaning of sin as opposition to God can only fully come into our experience and our knowledge in the wake of Christ's resurrection and ascension. That there is something morally clear and alert, and that may mean confrontational, about the age between the ascension of Christ and his second coming. And to live in that age, which is what we're all given to do, is to be ever more aware of this. That is the best I can sum it up. I don't know whether that makes me an optimist or a pessimist. Depends which side you're coming from.
Right. We are reminded that pride has progress in it, that it lives in time and across time, and that the gospel in part is God breaking into time. And we are grateful that you have broken into our time this day, Oliver. And so a word of thanks and a word of appreciation for your time with us.